In the autumn of 1066, on a morning when the sun burned too hot and the air hung thick with the weight of fate, the good knight stood on a ridge above the River Derwent and watched the dust of an army rise like smoke from the earth. King Harold Godwinson had marched his Housecarls and thegns 200 miles in 4 days, a feat that should have been impossible, and now they stood, exhausted and silent, staring down at the glint of Norwegian steel scattered across the meadows below. This was Stamford Bridge, a wooden crossing over a quiet river in Yorkshire, and it would become the grave of the Viking age. Watch as the good knight survives the lightning march that broke men and horses, the lone berserker who held a bridge against an army, and the shield wall where kings died and brothers faced each other across a line of iron. This is the story of the battle that ended 3 centuries of Scandinavian terror in England, and the victory that cost Harold Godwinson his kingdom. Subscribe to the Good Knight Stories for more journeys through history's greatest turning points, where our silver-armored knight walks beside you through the blood, the silence, and the weight of what comes after. But for now, settle in and step back to September 25th, 1066, the day the last Viking invasion died on English soil. Chapter 1. The crisis. The good knight had been in London when the news arrived. It came in fragments, carried by riders whose horses were lathered white and trembling. The north had fallen. York had surrendered. A Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada, the terror of the Mediterranean, the veteran of 1,000 battles, had landed with 300 ships and an army that stretched from horizon to horizon. The northern earls, Edwin and Morcar, had met him at Fulford, just outside the city walls, and been shattered. The fyrd of Mercia and Northumbria lay broken in the mud, and the north was open. The good knight stood in the courtyard of the king's hall, his mail still smelling of oil and rust, and listened to the murmur of the other Housecarls. They were the king's sworn men, the professional warriors of England, and they knew what this meant. Harold Godwinson, crowned barely 9 months earlier after the death of Edward the Confessor, had been waiting in the south for William of Normandy. The Norman duke had been gathering ships and men all summer, threatening invasion from across the Channel. Harold had kept his army mobilized for months, watching the coast, burning supplies so the Normans would find nothing if they landed. And now, with the south still undefended, the north had exploded into war. The good knight had served Harold for years. He had fought beside him in Wales, had seen him break the power of Gruffydd ap Llywelyn, had watched him negotiate and maneuver through the treacherous politics of the Witan. Harold was not a man who hesitated. When the last rider dismounted and knelt before the king, Harold's face was stone. "How many ships?" Harold asked. 300, my lord. Maybe more. And Hardrada? He is there, and Tostig is with him. The name hung in the air like a curse. Tostig Godwinson, Harold's brother. The man who had been Earl of Northumbria until his own people rose against him, who had fled to Flanders and spent a year begging for support, who had raided the English coast in the spring like a common pirate. And now he had returned, not as a penitent brother, but as the ally of a foreign king, leading an invasion force into the heart of England. The good knight saw Harold's jaw tighten. For a moment the king said nothing. Then he turned to his brothers, Gurth and Leofwine, both earls, both warriors, and spoke quietly. "We march north. Now." Gurth stepped forward. "My lord, the Normans. The Normans are still in Normandy. Hardrada is in York. If we do not move now, the north is lost. If the north is lost, there is no kingdom to defend." Leofwine nodded. "How fast?" "As fast as we can move." The good knight felt the weight of those words settle into his bones. He had marched before. Every housecarl had. But this would be different. This would be a race against time, against distance, against the limits of what a man could endure. Harold raised his voice so the entire hall could hear. "We leave at dawn. Full kit, horses, for those who have them. The feared will follow as they can. We take the Housecarls, the thegns, and anyone who can keep pace. We will not stop until we reach York." The good knight returned to his quarters and began to prepare. His gear was already laid out, as it always was. The hauberk, 30 pounds of interlocking iron rings, knee-length, split at the sides for riding. The conical helmet with its nasal guard. The round shield of lime wood, painted and bossed. The Danish axe, its blade as wide as a man's hand, its haft as tall as his shoulder. The seax, the long knife every warrior carried. The leather belt, the woolen tunic, the leg wrappings, the boots. He checked every piece. The mail for broken rings, the axe edge for nicks, the shield for cracks. A man who went into battle with faulty gear did not come back. Outside, the city was already moving. Horses were being saddled, supplies loaded. The feared, the militia levies from the shires, were being mustered, though most of them would never keep pace with the Housecarls. This would be a forced march, and only the fastest would see the battle. The good knight slept for a few hours, though sleep was thin and restless. In his dreams, he saw the north burning. Chapter 2. The March. They left London before the sun rose. The good knight rode in the vanguard, his horse a sturdy courser bred for endurance rather than speed. Around him, the Housecarls moved in a column that stretched back into the darkness, their mail clinking softly, their breath misting in the cold morning air. Harold rode at the front, his banner, the fighting man, snapping in the wind. The road north was the old Roman road, Ermine Street, a ribbon of stone that cut straight through the heart of England. It was the fastest route, and Harold intended to use every mile of it. The first day they covered 40 miles. The good knight had thought he understood what a forced march meant. He had been wrong. This was not a march. This was a sprint stretched across days. They rode from dawn until long after dark, stopping only to water the horses and choke down cold rations. There was no time to cook, no time to rest. The men who fell behind were left behind. By the second day, the good knight's body had begun to break down. His thighs were raw from the saddle, his back ached from the weight of the mail, his hands were blistered from gripping the reins. He had not slept more than a few hours since leaving London, and his mind had begun to drift into a strange, dreamlike state where the road seemed to stretch on forever and the horizon never grew closer. Around him, other men were suffering worse. Some of the younger thanes, less accustomed to the weight of full war gear, were swaying in their saddles. Horses began to go lame, their legs buckling under the relentless pace. The column grew thinner as men and mounts fell away, unable to continue. But Harold did not slow. The good knight understood why. Every hour they delayed was an hour Hardrada had to consolidate his hold on the north. Every day they rested was a day the Norwegians could fortify York, gather supplies, and prepare for a siege. Speed was the only advantage the English had. If they lost it, they lost everything. On the third day, the good knight stopped feeling pain. His body had moved beyond exhaustion into a kind of numb endurance. He rode mechanically, his mind empty. His vision narrowed to the road ahead. He ate without tasting. He drank without thinking. He existed only to move forward. The landscape changed as they rode north. The flat fields of the south gave way to rolling hills, then to the rougher terrain of the Midlands. The air grew colder. The sky grew wider. The good knight had been born in the south, and the north felt like a foreign country, harsher, older, less tamed by Roman roads and Christian churches. On the fourth day, they reached Tadcaster, a small town just south of York. The good knight dismounted and nearly collapsed. His legs would not hold him. He leaned against his horse, breathing hard, and looked around. The other housecarls were in similar condition, grey-faced, hollow-eyed, moving like old men. They had covered nearly 200 miles in 4 days. It was a feat that should have been impossible, and yet they had done it. Harold called his commanders together. The good knight was not among them. He was a warrior, not a lord, but he could see the king's face in the firelight. Harold looked as exhausted as any of them, but his eyes were sharp. "We rest here tonight," Harold said. "Tomorrow we march on York. If the Norwegians are still there, we fight. If they have withdrawn, we pursue. Either way, this ends soon." The good knight found a place to sleep in the corner of a barn. He did not bother to remove his mail. He simply lay down on the straw, closed his eyes, and fell into a sleep so deep it felt like drowning. Chapter 3. The Ridge. The good knight woke to the sound of horns. It was still dark. He sat up, his body screaming in protest, and reached for his axe. Around him, the other housecarls were stirring, pulling on helmets, checking weapons. No one spoke. There was no need. They marched before dawn, moving quietly through the streets of Tadcaster and onto the road to York. The good knight's horse was gone, lame and left behind. So he walked, his shield slung over his back, his axe resting on his shoulder. The weight of the mail was crushing, but he had learned long ago how to carry it, how to distribute the load across his shoulders and hips so that no single part of his body bore too much. The sun rose as they climbed the ridge south of York. The good knight reached the crest and stopped. Below him, the city of York spread out along the River Ouse, its walls dark against the morning light. But the city was not what held his attention. To the east, beyond the city, the land opened into a wide river valley. The River Derwent cut through it, a silver ribbon in the early light. And on the far side of the river, scattered across the meadows and low hills, were the Norwegians. The good knight had seen armies before, but this was something else. The Norwegian camp stretched for miles, a sea of tents and banners and men. Smoke rose from 100 cooking fires, horses grazed in the fields. Ships, longships, dozens of them, were drawn up along the riverbank at Riccall, their dragon prows gleaming. And then he saw the bridge. Stamford Bridge. A narrow wooden structure spanning the Derwent, barely wide enough for 2 men to cross side by side. On the far side of the bridge, a smaller group of Norwegians had gathered, perhaps a few hundred men, maybe more. They were not in formation. They were lounging, talking, some of them sitting in the grass. They looked like men waiting for a peaceful meeting, not a battle, because that was what they were expecting. The good knight heard the murmur ripple through the English ranks. The Norwegians had no idea they were here. Harold's forced march had achieved total surprise. One of the housecarls near the good knight laughed, a short, bitter sound. "They think we're still in London." Another spat into the grass. "They're about to learn otherwise." Harold rode along the ridge, his banner held high. When he reached the center of the line, he turned his horse to face the army and raised his voice. "They do not know we are here. They are not armored. They are not ready. We will hit them hard, and we will hit them fast. The bridge is the key. Take the bridge, and we take the field. Take the field, and we end this." He paused, and his voice grew quieter, though it still carried across the ridge. "My brother is down there, Tostig Godwinson. He has betrayed his king, his country, and his blood. If he will not surrender, he will die with the rest of them." The good knight saw the pain in Harold's face, just for a moment, before the king's expression hardened into stone. "For England," Harold said. "For England," the army roared back, and then they descended the ridge. Chapter 4. The West Bank. The good knight moved with the vanguard, his axe in both hands, his shield left behind for speed. The English line swept down the slope like a wave, and the Norwegians on the west bank of the Derwent looked up too late. The first Viking the good knight saw was a young man, barely old enough to grow a beard, wearing a leather jerkin and holding a spear. His eyes went wide as the English housecarls crashed into him. The good knight's axe took him in the chest, the blade shearing through leather and bone, and the boy went down without a sound. The west bank dissolved into chaos. The Norwegians here were not the main army. They were foragers, sentries, men who had been sent across the river to gather supplies or stand watch. They were not expecting a battle, and they were not prepared for one. Most of them were not wearing mail. Some did not even have helmets. The good knight moved through them like a reaper through wheat. His axe rose and fell, each stroke ending a life. Blood sprayed across his mail. His arms burned with the effort. Around him, the other housecarls were doing the same, their axes and swords cutting through the unarmored Vikings with brutal efficiency. The Norwegians broke. They ran for the bridge, stumbling over each other, throwing down their weapons, screaming for help. The good knight pursued, his breath coming in ragged gasps, his vision narrowing to the fleeing backs in front of him. He reached the bridge just as the last of the Vikings scrambled across, and he raised his axe to follow. And stopped. A man stood on the bridge. He was alone. A single Norwegian warrior, planted in the center of the narrow wooden span, his feet spread wide, his hands gripping the haft of a massive Dane axe. He was huge, taller than any man the good knight had ever seen, broad-shouldered and thick-armed, his beard braided and his eyes wild. He wore no mail, only a tunic and trousers, but he stood like a mountain. Behind the Gistjern, good knight, the English vanguard piled up, unable to advance. The bridge was too narrow. Only 1 or 2 men could approach at a time, and the giant blocked the way. One of the thanes stepped forward, sword raised, and the giant's axe moved in a blur. The blade caught the thane in the side of the neck, and his head came half off, blood fountaining. He fell into the river. Another man tried, and another, and another. The giant killed them all. The good knight watched, his chest heaving, as the bodies piled up on the bridge. The giant was not just strong, he was skilled. Every swing of his axe was precise, economical, devastating. He used the narrow space to his advantage, forcing the English to come at him one at a time, and he cut them down as they came. 40 men, the sagas would later say. 40 Englishmen died on that bridge, and the giant stood alone. Untouched, his axe red to the haft. The good knight felt a cold knot of fear in his gut. This was not a man. This was a berserker, a warrior who had given himself over to the fury of battle, who felt no pain and knew no fear. The good knight had heard stories of such men, but he had never faced one. And then, from somewhere behind the English line, a voice shouted, "The river! Get under the bridge!" The good knight turned and saw one of the fairdmen, a farmer by the look of him, too old to be a warrior, dragging a wooden trough toward the riverbank. It was a swill tub, the kind used to feed pigs, hollowed out and wide enough to float. The old man climbed into the tub and pushed off into the river. The current carried him downstream, under the bridge, and the good knight understood. The bridge was made of wooden planks laid across timber supports. There were gaps between the planks. If a man could get underneath, if he had a spear long enough. The giant on the bridge did not see the tub. He was focused on the English in front of him, his axe rising and falling, his breath coming in great bellowing roars. He did not see the old man float beneath him. He did not see the spear thrust up through the gap in the planks. The spear took him in the groin, driving up into his pelvis, and the giant screamed. It was a sound the good knight would never forget, a howl of agony and rage that seemed to shake the air. The giant staggered, his axe falling from his hands, and he collapsed onto the bridge, blood pouring from the wound. The English surged forward. The good knight was among the first across. He stepped over the giant's body, still twitching, still alive, and onto the east bank. Ahead, the main Norwegian army was forming up, their shields locking together, their voices rising in a war chant. The real battle was about to begin. The English army poured across the bridge, spreading out along the east bank of the Derwent. The good knight moved with them, his axe still in his hands, his mail heavy with blood and sweat. The sun was higher now, and the heat was building. It was unseasonably warm for late September, hot enough that the good knight could feel the sweat running down his back, soaking into the padding under his mail. Across the meadow, the Norwegians were forming a shield wall. The good knight had fought against shield walls before. They were the foundation of northern European warfare, a line of overlapping shields, each man protecting the man beside him, the front rank bristling with spears and axes. A well-formed shield wall was nearly impenetrable. Breaking one required discipline, strength, and a willingness to die. But the Norwegians were at a disadvantage. Most of them were not wearing mail. The heat had been oppressive, and they had been expecting a peaceful hostage exchange, not a battle. 2/3 of the Norwegian army had left their armor back at the ships, 12 miles away at Riccall. Now they stood in tunics and leather, facing an enemy in full war gear. The good knight could see the Norwegian banners in the center of the line. One was the raven banner of Harald Hardrada, the legendary land waster, that was said to bring victory to its bearer and death to its bearer's enemies. The other was simpler, the banner of Tostig Godwinson, Harold's brother. The English line formed opposite the Norwegians, and for a moment the two armies simply stared at each other across the meadow. The good knight could hear the sound of his own breathing, the creak of leather, the clink of mail. The air smelled of trampled grass and river water and the faint coppery tang of blood from the bridge. And then, from the English line, a single rider emerged. He was alone, mounted on a grey horse, wearing mail and a helmet but carrying no weapon. He rode slowly toward the Norwegian shield wall, and the good knight felt the tension in the English ranks rise. This was a parley, a negotiation. The rider stopped a spear's throw from the Norwegian line and raised his voice. "I seek Tostig Godwinson, Earl of Northumbria." There was a pause, and then a man stepped forward from the Norwegian ranks. He was tall, dark-haired, his face hard and weathered. Tostig. "I am here," Tostig called back. The rider spoke again, his voice carrying across the field. "Your brother, King Harold, offers you peace. Lay down your arms, and you will have your earldom back. 1/3 of the kingdom will be yours. No man will be punished for following you. This can end now, without more blood." Tostig was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "And what of my ally? What does my brother offer King Harald of Norway?" The rider's response was cold and clear. 7 feet of ground, or as much more as he is taller than other men. The good knight felt a chill run through him. It was a death sentence, delivered with the formality of a legal judgment. Harold was offering his brother mercy, but only if Tostig abandoned his ally. If Tostig refused, he would die with the Norwegians. Tostig looked back at the Norwegian king, standing beneath the raven banner. Then he turned back to the rider. "I will not betray the man who trusted me when my own brother cast me out. Tell Harold that if he wants the north, he will have to take it." The rider nodded once, then turned his horse and rode back toward the English line. As he passed the good knight, The good knight saw his face clearly for the first time. It was Harold. The king had ridden out alone to offer his brother one last chance at peace, and Tostig had refused. The good knight heard the murmur ripple through the Norwegian ranks as they realized who the rider had been. One of the Norwegian jarls shouted something to Tostig, and Tostig shouted back, "That was Harold Godwinson, King of England, my brother!" The Norwegian king, Harald Hardrada, laughed, a booming, joyless sound. A small man on a great horse, but he rode bravely. Tostig's voice was bitter. He is a great king, and we are about to die fighting him. The two armies closed. The good knight moved forward with the English line, his axe raised, his shield, retrieved from the west bank, locked with the shields of the men beside him. The Housecarls formed the centre of the line, the most experienced and heavily armoured warriors, with the thegns and ferdmen on the flanks. Harold's brothers Gurth and Leofwine commanded the wings, their voices rising above the din as they shouted orders and encouragement. The Norwegians came to meet them, their shield wall advancing at a steady pace, their voices rising in a war chant that was older than Christianity, older than England itself. The good knight could see their faces now, bearded, scarred, fierce. These were not farmers or merchants. These were warriors, men who had sailed across the North Sea to carve out a kingdom with their swords. But they were not wearing mail. The two lines collided with a sound like thunder. The good knight's shield slammed into the shield of the man opposite him, and the impact drove the breath from his lungs. He braced his legs, pushing back, and felt the Norwegian push in return. For a moment, they were locked together, neither side giving ground, the pressure immense. And then the good knight swung his axe. The blade came over the top of his shield, a short, brutal chop aimed at the Norwegian's head. The man raised his own shield to block, and the axe bit into the wood, splitting it. The good knight wrenched the axe free and swung again, this time lower, and the blade caught the Norwegian in the shoulder. Without mail to protect him, the man's shoulder came apart, bone and muscle shearing under the impact. He screamed and fell back, and the good knight stepped into the gap. Around him, the Housecarls were doing the same. Their axes rose and fell in a terrible rhythm, each stroke breaking shields, shattering bones, ending lives. The Norwegians fought back with desperate courage, their spears thrusting, their swords slashing, but without armour, they were dying faster than they could kill. The good knight's world narrowed to the space directly in front of him. He did not think, he did not plan. He simply moved, block, strike, step, block, strike, step. His arms burned. His lungs screamed for air. Blood covered his hands, making the axe haft slippery. He could not tell if it was his blood or someone else's. A spear thrust at his face, and he caught it on his shield. The point punched through the wood, stopping inches from his eye. He twisted the shield, trapping the spear, and swung his axe in a wide arc. The blade took the spearman in the side of the head, and the man dropped. Another Norwegian came at him, this one with a sword, and the good knight met him head-on. Their weapons clashed, axe against sword, and the good knight felt the shock of the impact run up his arms. The Norwegian was strong, but the good knight was stronger. He shoved forward, using his weight and his shield to drive the man back, and then he hooked the axe blade behind the man's knee and pulled. The Norwegian fell, and the good knight's axe came down on his chest. The shield wall was breaking. The Norwegians, without armour and facing the disciplined fury of the Housecarls, were being pushed back step by step. The good knight could see gaps opening in their line, men falling and not being replaced, the cohesion that made a shield wall effective beginning to fray. And then, from the centre of the Norwegian line, a roar went up. The good knight looked and saw Harald Hardrada. The Norwegian king had thrown aside his shield and was charging forward, his axe in both hands, his face twisted in a berserker's fury. He was enormous, taller even than the giant on the bridge, and he moved with a speed that seemed impossible for a man his size. His axe swept through the English line like a scythe, and men fell before him, their shields split, their bodies broken. The good knight felt the English line waver. This was the terror of the berserker, a man who fought without fear, without thought, driven only by rage and the will to kill. Hardrada was cutting a path through the Housecarls, and, for a moment, it seemed like he might break the English line by himself, and then an arrow took him in the throat. The good knight did not see who loosed it. One moment Hardrada was roaring and swinging his axe, and the next he was staggering, his hands clutching at the shaft protruding from his neck. Blood poured between his fingers. He tried to speak, but only a wet, choking sound came out. He fell to his knees, and then onto his face, and the raven banner fell with him. The Norwegian line shuddered. The good knight saw the moment when the battle turned. The death of Hardrada broke something in the Norwegian army. Not their courage, but their hope. They had followed him across the sea, had trusted him to lead them to victory, and now he was dead, face down in the mud of a foreign field. But they did not run. Not yet. Tostig Godwinson stepped forward, taking up the fallen banner, and his voice rang out across the battlefield. "For Hardrada, for the north, we do not yield." The Norwegians roared in response, and the battle resumed with even greater fury. The good knight did not know how long the fighting lasted. Time had ceased to have meaning. There was only the endless cycle of block, strike, step, the weight of the axe in his hands, the pressure of the shield against his arm, the taste of blood and dust in his mouth. He was dimly aware that the sun had climbed higher, that the heat was now unbearable, that men on both sides were collapsing from exhaustion and heat stroke, as much as from wounds. His mail felt like it was cooking him alive, the iron rings hot enough to burn through the padding beneath. Sweat poured down his face, stinging his eyes, and his breath came in ragged gasps. But he did not stop. The Norwegian line was crumbling. With Hardrada dead and their numbers thinning, they were being pushed back toward the river. The good knight could see Tostig in the center of the line, still holding the raven banner, still shouting defiance, but the men around him were falling one by one. And then Harold called for another parley. The fighting paused, both sides stepping back, gasping for breath. The good knight leaned on his axe, his legs trembling, and watched as Harold rode forward again, alone, to the edge of the Norwegian line. "Tostig," Harold called, "Hardrada is dead. Your army is broken. Surrender now, and I will spare the men who remain. You will have your life and your honor. This does not have to end with your death." Tostig stood in the center of the Norwegian line, the raven banner in his hands, and for a long moment he said nothing. The good knight could see his face, even from a distance, exhausted, bloodied, but still defiant. "I will not beg for mercy from the man who cast me out," Tostig said. "I will not kneel to the brother who chose the throne over his own blood. If you want this field, Harold, you will have to take it over my body." Harold's voice was quiet, but it carried. "So be it." He turned his horse and rode back to the English line. The good knight saw the grief on his face, just for a moment, before the king's expression hardened into stone. The battle resumed. The good knight moved forward with the Housecarls, and this time the Norwegians did not hold. They were too few, too exhausted, too broken by the death of their king. The shield wall collapsed, and the fighting devolved into a chaotic melee, small knots of men hacking at each other in the blood-soaked grass. The good knight saw Tostig fall. He was surrounded by Housecarls, his banner torn from his hands, his sword broken. He fought to the end, using the jagged remains of his blade like a dagger, but there were too many. An axe took him in the side, and he went down, and the Housecarls closed over him like a wave. The good knight did not see who struck the killing blow. He only saw Tostig's body, lying in the mud, his eyes open and staring at the sky. The Norwegians broke. Those who could still run fled toward the river, toward the ships at Riccall, and the English pursued. The good knight ran with them, his axe in his hands, his vision blurred with sweat and blood. He caught a fleeing Viking and brought him down with a blow to the back of the legs. He stepped over the body and kept running. And then, from the east, a new sound rose. A roar of voices, the thunder of feet, the clash of weapons. Reinforcements. The good knight stopped, his chest heaving, and stared. From the direction of Riccall, a fresh Norwegian force was approaching. They were running, sprinting, across the fields, their weapons raised, their voices rising in a war cry. There were hundreds of them, maybe thousands, and they were moving fast. This was Eystein Orre, Hardrada's prospective son-in-law, leading the men who had been left to guard the ships. When word of the battle reached them, they had grabbed their weapons and run the 12 miles to Stamford Bridge, desperate to save their king and their comrades. But they were too late to save anyone, and they were about to die. The good knight could see that many of them were not wearing mail. Like the first wave of Norwegians, they had left their armor at the ships, unable to run in the heat while carrying 30 pounds of iron. Some had brought their mail and were now staggering under the weight, their faces red, their breath coming in gasps. Others had thrown their armor aside halfway and arrived with nothing but tunics and weapons. They crashed into the English line like a wave, and for a moment, the momentum of their charge pushed the English back. The good knight was nearly knocked off his feet by the press of bodies. He swung his axe blindly, felt it connect with something solid, and pulled it free. But the Norwegians were already dying. They had run 12 miles in the heat, fueled by adrenaline and desperation, and their bodies were shutting down. The good knight saw men collapse without being struck, their faces purple, foam on their lips. Heat stroke, exhaustion, dehydration. They fell like wheat before a scythe, and the English housecarls cut them down as they fell. Eystein Orre fought like a demon, his axe rising and falling, his voice hoarse from shouting, but he could not hold the line. The men around him were too exhausted, too disorganized, too broken. Within minutes, the counterattack had stalled. Within an hour, it had collapsed. Orre fell, an English spear through his chest, and the last organized resistance died with him. The Norwegians fled. They ran for the river, for the ships, for anywhere that was not here. The English pursued, cutting them down as they ran, and the Derwent ran red with blood. The good knight saw men drown, weighed down by their gear, their bodies choking the river. He saw others trampled by their own comrades in the panic to escape. And then, finally, it was over. Chapter 9. The silence after. The good knight stood on the bank of the Derwent and stared at the field. The meadow was covered in bodies. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Norwegians mostly, but English too. Housecarls and thegns and fyrdsmen who had fallen in the shield wall or the pursuit. The grass was trampled and soaked with blood. The air was thick with the smell of death, blood and shit and the sickly sweet stench of opened bodies. The good knight's axe hung loose in his hand. He could not remember dropping his shield. His mail was dented and torn, the rings broken in a dozen places. His left arm was bleeding from a cut he did not remember receiving. His right shoulder was a mass of bruises where a Norwegian's axe had struck his mail but not penetrated. He was alive. Around him, the other survivors were moving through the field, checking the bodies, finishing the wounded, gathering weapons and armor. Some of the English were weeping, others were laughing, the high, brittle laughter of men who had survived something they should not have. Harold Godwinson stood near the center of the field, staring down at the body of his brother. Tostig's face was peaceful, almost serene, as if he had finally found the rest that had eluded him in life. Harold knelt beside him, and for a long moment the king did not move. Then he stood, and his voice rang out across the field. "Bury the dead, ours and theirs. They fought bravely, and they deserve that much." The good knight found a place to sit, away from the bodies, and began to check his wounds. The cut on his arm was shallow, already clotting. The bruises would heal. He was scarred, weary, but alive. He thought about the march from London, the 4 days of agony, the endless road, the weight of the mail and the axe, and the knowledge that if they did not move fast enough, the north would be lost. He thought about the bridge, and the giant who had held it alone, and the old man in the swill tub who had ended him. He thought about the shield wall, and the faces of the men he had killed, and the sound of Hardrada's death rattle. He thought about Tostig, and the grief on Harold's face, and the terrible cost of this victory. The north was saved. The Viking age was over. England was safe. For now. Chapter 10. The Reckoning. The good knight spent the next 2 days at Stamford Bridge, helping to bury the dead and tend to the wounded. The scale of the slaughter was almost incomprehensible. Of the 300 ships that had brought the Norwegian army to England, only 24 were needed to carry the survivors home. The rest of the Norwegians lay in mass graves on the banks of the Derwent, or floated downstream toward the sea. The English losses were lighter, but still significant. Dozens of housecarls had fallen, men the good knight had known for years, warriors who had fought beside him in Wales and Northumbria, and a dozen other forgotten skirmishes. The Fyrd had suffered too, though many of them had never reached the battle, falling behind during the forced march or arriving too late to fight. The good knight's wounds were tended by one of the camp followers, an old woman who washed the cut on his arm with water and watercress, and bound it with clean linen. She gave him a poultice of garlic and honey for the bruises, and a cup of something bitter that she said would help him sleep. He did not sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the bridge and the giant and the bodies piling up in the river. On the 3rd day, a rider arrived from the south. The good knight was sitting outside his tent, sharpening his axe, when he heard the commotion. He looked up and saw Harold striding toward the center of the camp, his face grim. The other commanders were gathering: Gurth, Leofwine, the thanes and earls who had survived the battle. The good knight stood and followed, his gut tightening with dread. The rider was covered in dust and sweat, his horse lathered and trembling. He knelt before Harold and spoke in a voice loud enough for everyone to hear. "My lord, the Normans have landed. Duke William crossed the Channel 3 days ago. He has taken Pevensey and is fortifying the coast. His army is moving inland." The silence that followed was absolute. The good knight felt the weight of those words settle over him like a shroud. They had won. They had saved the north, had ended the Viking threat, had achieved a victory that would be remembered for generations. And it meant nothing. Because, while they had been fighting Hardrada, William had crossed the Channel. While they had been burying the dead at Stamford Bridge, the Normans had been landing on the southern coast. And now, exhausted and battered, the English army would have to march south and fight again. Harold's voice was quiet, but it carried across the camp. "How many ships?" "Hundreds, my lord. Thousands of men. Knights, archers, infantry. William has brought everything." Harold nodded slowly. Then he turned to his brothers. "We march south. Now." Gurth stepped forward, his face pale. "My lord, the men are exhausted. Half of them can barely walk. We need time to rest, to gather reinforcements." "There is no time," Harold said. "Every day we delay is a day William has to fortify his position, to gather supplies, to burn our lands. We march now, or we lose the south." Leofwine spoke up. "Then let me lead the vanguard. You stay here, gather a fresh army, and follow when you are ready. We can slow William down, buy you time. No. Harold's voice was flat, final. I will not let William burn my kingdom while I sit in the north. We march together, and we end this together. The good knight saw the despair on Gurth's face, the resignation on Leofwin's. They knew, as he knew, that this was a mistake. The army was broken, the Housecarls were battered, the Fyrd was scattered. They needed time to recover, to regroup, to prepare. But Harold would not wait, because Harold was a warrior, and warriors did not wait while their enemies burned their lands and killed their people. The good knight returned to his tent and began to pack his gear. His mail was still torn, the rings broken in a dozen places, but there was no time to repair it. His axe was sharp, his shield was intact, and that would have to be enough. He thought about the march to Stamford Bridge, and the battle, and the bodies in the river. He thought about the exhaustion that had settled into his bones, the deep, aching weariness that no amount of sleep could cure. And he thought about the march south, and the battle that was waiting for them, and the knowledge that this time they might not win. But he was a housecarl. He had sworn an oath to Harold Godwinson to fight for him and die for him if necessary. And so he would march south, and he would fight, and if he died, he would die with his axe in his hands and his king at his side. That was what it meant to be a housecarl. That was what it meant to be the good knight. Chapter 11. The Second March. They left York on September 28th, 3 days after the battle. The good knight rode in the column, his body a mass of aches and pains, his mind numb with exhaustion. Around him, the other housecarls moved like ghosts, their faces hollow, their eyes distant. They had won at Stamford Bridge, but the victory felt like a defeat. The march south was slower than the march north. Too many men were wounded, too many horses were lame, too many supplies had been expended. The Fyrd, which had been left behind during the race to York, was now struggling to catch up, and the army was strung out over miles of road. The good knight did not speak to the other men. There was nothing to say. They all knew what was waiting for them in the south. They all knew that they were marching toward another battle, and that this time they might not survive. The days blurred together, the road, the camps, the cold rations, the sleepless nights. The good knight's wounds began to heal, but the exhaustion did not fade. It was a deep, bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest could cure. On October 6th, they reached London. Harold did not stop. He gathered what reinforcements he could, fresh Fyrdmen from the southern shires, a few thanes who had not marched north, and continued south toward the coast. The good knight heard rumours that Harold's advisers were begging him to wait, to let William come to him, to fight from a position of strength. But Harold would not wait. On October the 13th, they reached the ridge near Hastings, and the good knight saw the Norman camp spread out below them, a sea of tents and banners and horses. The Norman army was fresh, rested, and ready. The English army was exhausted, battered, and broken. The good knight stood on the ridge and stared down at the Normans, and he knew, with a cold certainty, that this was where it would end. Not at Stamford Bridge, where they had won, but here, at Hastings, where they would lose. Epilogue. The Cost of Victory. The good knight survived Stamford Bridge. He stood on the banks of the Derwent on the evening of September 25th, 1066, and watched the sun set over a field of the dead. He had fought in the shield wall, had killed men whose names he would never know, had seen kings fall and brothers die. He had won. But the victory at Stamford Bridge was the beginning of the end. The forced march north, the brutal battle, the exhaustion and the wounds, all of it had broken the English army. And when William of Normandy landed 3 days later, There was no time to recover, no time to rest, no time to prepare. The good knight would march south, and he would fight at Hastings, and he would see the end of the Anglo-Saxon kingdom. But that is a story for another time. For now, he stood on the banks of the Derwent, his axe in his hands, his mail torn and bloodied, and he allowed himself a moment of quiet. The Viking age was over. The last great invasion had been defeated. And the good knight had survived to see it. He would carry the scars of Stamford Bridge for the rest of his life, the cut on his arm, the bruises on his shoulder, the memories of the men he had killed and the friends he had lost. But he was alive, and for a warrior that was enough. Our good knight will return. Subscribe for more.